Welcome to Inflection Point Podcast, where we cultivate change from the inside out as we ponder the Cairo question. Will Cairo have to protest in his lifetime for the birthright to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which he was born? We stand on the belief that dismantling racism goes beyond laws and legislation or politics and economics. Here, anti-racism activation is presented as an inside job where personal transformation and accountability impact social change. So take a seat at the anti-racism activation table with Inflection Point Podcast.
Well, hello, and thank you for tuning in again to another episode of Inflection Point Podcast. We are dedicated to the art of listening and authentic conversation. We challenge our audience to listen actively and intentionally for the purpose of critical self-reflection, in-depth perspective taking, personal transformation, and ultimately social impact. The 2024 theme explores the art of community conversations in today's climate of systemic and institutional racism, anti-racism activation, equity, diversity and inclusion, and book banning. I am your host, Anita Russell, and here's a quick hello from co-hosts Mavis and Gail.
Hey, Mavis Bauman.
Hi, I'm Gail Hunter, and welcome this evening.
Wonderful, wonderful. So in the previous episode, we took a deep dive into leadership as a social process as defined by the Center for Creative Leadership using their DAC model. And DAC is an acronym for Direction, Alignment, and Commitment, which reflects the potential that is all around us, including the potential for justice. So we also use stories from two specific YouTube channels to demonstrate true leadership through the eyes of perspective of giving action-driven leadership, decisions that are related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And today's episode, I am so happy we are continuing the conversation around organizational leadership, but we're looking at it through the lens of and the eyes of Shereen Daniels. She is the managing director of HR Rewired and chair of the African Diaspora Economic Inclusion Foundation. She is also a gifted speaker, educator, and author of a best-selling book, The Antiracist Organization, Dismantling Systemic Racism in the Workplace. And the book is really powerful. So we're going to present some of her thoughts, if you will, on this particular topic. So I am going to start off by just giving you a little bit of background of why we're having this particular conversation. So if you have been following us for a while, you know that when we started off using Harvard professor Robert Livingston, using his book as a primary resource for us as we were building out how we wanted these conversations to happen, right? And he is the author of The Conversation, How Seeking and Speaking the Truth About Racism Can Radically Transform Individuals and Organizations. So we use that book to kind of build out some of the topics that we cover, a lot of it through the individual lens. So that became a foundational piece of work that was a major catalyst for Inflection Point Podcast. So today we want to talk about the work of Shereen Daniels. So she is a London-based strategist, speaker, and educator who runs an advisory firm called HR Rewired. She is the chair, as I mentioned previously, she is the chair of the African Diaspora Economic Inclusion Foundation, which is an organization that contributes to reducing the economic inequalities impacting the UK's African diaspora business community with a specific focus on female entrepreneurs. She is also the founder of the conference series, Advancing Racial Equity, Moving Beyond the Conversation. And two of her podcasts include HR Rewired, Advancing Racial Equity 4.0, and Turning the Page with the Antiracist Organization. So her book, this new book, to me, it kind of links directly to Dr. Livingston's book, who started off and opened up the way for these conversations to happen at the individual and the organizational level. But what I like about Shereen Daniels' book is that she really takes a deep dive into the anti-racist organization and looking at how organizations can participate in dismantling racism, dismantling systemic racism right in the workplace. And one of the articles that I had read, she talks about anti-racism not just being an American issue. So it's this conversation that she had in an interview with Forbes back in 2022. And she talked about why she felt it was necessary to write and what keeps her hopeful about engaging in anti-racism work with organizations. And so I, did a little bit of research, got some background information on her book, and I visited her Amazon author page. And on her Amazon author page, this was a quote that I picked up. An indispensable exploration of how systemic racism is ingrained into business structures, policies, and procedures. The Antiracist Organization, Dismantling Systemic Racism in the Workplace, belongs in the libraries of all business leaders seeking to make their workplace more inclusive and equitable. And so when I think about this work that she does, and she sort of kind of aligns with some of the things that I talk about in terms of what does it actually look like to cultivate an anti-racism mindset, if you will, or an anti-racism culture. So she really digs into it through that organizational lens, right? And she talks about executives, leaders who can push past the discomfort to lead change credibly and authentically. And so when I think about these words that I'm hearing as I'm getting a little bit more into her book, I haven't fully read the book yet, but I wanted to highlight the book in this episode to really, really hone in on the importance, not just of looking at racism and anti-racism through that lens of cultivating individual change, which is part of what I do, but also really looking at it through that organizational lens. And she goes on to talk about recognizing the problem of systemic racism and implementing impactful solutions. So in the previous episode, when we gave the example of the two leaders who did exactly that, these were two individuals who recognized a problem, a concern related to systemic racism within their own organizations. And these two individuals took the right approaches. And when I say the right approaches, I'm looking at it through the lens of some of the things that Shereen Daniels is describing in her book, right? Empowering colleagues to become pioneers of change, recognizing that diversity and inclusion initiatives haven't solved the problem. So that's more than just having an initiative. It's more than just having some priorities written on your elevator so that employees are seeing it on a regular basis. It's so much deeper than that. It's recognizing that diversity and inclusion initiatives haven't solved the problem, right? I got involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion years ago when it was primarily just focused on diversity and inclusion. That was years ago. I left corporate America in 2013. It is now 2024, and we're still wrestling with some of those same concepts, those same ideas, those same pervasive beliefs, right? And then she goes on to say that realizing language, how do we talk about these things in the workplace? That language can be a weapon to perpetrate systemic racism, right? When you start thinking about things like reverse racism, that's a language that is a weapon that is used within the context of systemic racism and maintaining the pillars, if you will, of systemic racism. Or language can be used as a tool to dismantle racism. And that is where we are now in these conversations. And again, connecting Inflection Point Podcast to the work of Professor Livingston with his book, and now having another powerful tool in our arsenal as we're building up the conversations that we want to have around the issue of systemic racism. So for me, it has been such a personal endeavor, the work that I do. It's about these individual conversations, but it's also about these organizational conversations. And so over the course of the last year and a half or so of my own work and my own journey, I've had the opportunity to work at the organizational level with those leaders who are really, really working to bring about the kind of change that we really want to see. And that's kind of change that can help us slowly and surely, but meticulously dismantle the stronghold of racism on this country. Mavis, Gail, comments?
Yes. There's a quote, and I was going to mention it later, but I'll mention it now because I think it's appropriate. It's also from Shereen, and from her book. And she said that the work is done when we no longer have to use the word anti-racism. I think that's perfect, right? Mm-hmm. And we still, as you said before, that you were still from when you quit corporate America until now, we're still dealing with the same issues. And it's time that it all changes. And we have to change it from within.
Absolutely. Maybe your thoughts?
One thing that really became clear for me in this process today, the content we've been reading, is the idea of tokenism. Mm-hmm. That a Black person on staff is not enough. Yeah. 20 Black people on staff is not enough. It's not the solution to the problem. It's talking, having the conversations, and listening in a different way to really hear, to hold a number of different truths at the same time. I think that that's where a lot of white people in particular go, is to the point where a Black person got the job. What is the problem? Mm-hmm. Just not that simple. And it requires the conversations to peel back, like very thin layers of an onion. What is really happening here? Am I really listening? Are you really speaking your truth? And so on. So I just find that another piece of profound information.
Excellent. And that's actually a really good segue into what we want to talk about in the next segment of our conversation. Because having these conversations, we've discovered how stressful it can be, right? And so that is one of the factors, because when I think about my own work going back when I was in corporate, leading an African American affinity group and things like that, there was always that sort of, I want to use the word strain in a way, when it comes to speaking our truth in an environment, particularly when it's an environment where the prevailing thought is assimilation, right? So when the prevailing thought is assimilation, I always felt like there was a part of myself that when I got up to the corporate door, I kind of had to take that part of my identity off and kind of leave it at the door and come in. And then, but after a while, that just doesn't work because you're denying your own sense of what your experiences are. So I'm going to actually pass the baton over to Mavis, and she's going to talk about something around protecting your peace when it comes to speaking up and being truthful and talking about your experiences, particularly in the workplace or in other organizations as well.
Right. Well, there's so much here. I'm going to do my best to have a clear message. I have found, at a personal level, when I am trying to be an interrupter in a conversation where it's becoming racist, that it's very scary. It feels risky. It doesn't feel safe to me either. And so I keep working on how I can talk about the subject of anti-racism in a really productive way. It seems to me that what I feel from mostly white people is, can we just cover that over? Can we just cover that over and not talk about that right now? Or package it in some way and put it somewhere that it doesn't keep coming up. It's time, folks, to really address this. This is doable. This is so doable. And so I really want to stress the idea of the capabilities that we have to speak about anti-racism when racism itself is happening. I do want to speak to an article that Shereen Daniels wrote that came across my desk at a really great time. But first, I'm going to talk about a video that I stumbled onto by Corey Carew. It's called Just Belonging, Finding the Courage to Interrupt Bias. And she talks in this video about the burden on her and on other Black people to speak their truth and what really happens. For example, white audiences, don't talk that loud. You're an angry Black woman, or you're a Black man who's scaring me. Or here we go again. Someone's playing the minority race card. She says, when we react that way to real stories, this is for white people here. When we react that way to real stories, real people, we find a way to say your story does not matter. The disparate treatment that you experience doesn't matter. Discrimination doesn't matter. Your reality doesn't matter. When we do that, we refuse to give visibility to the truth in experiences of people. And when we do that around any racial injustice, we amplify the impact. So I think that most people don't want to amplify the impact of racism. They probably do want to understand it on some level. But here is the kind of reaction, what I just described, that shuts down the conversation. We don't engage. We just start shouting at each other. Something that, we've really taken as a central tenet in this podcast. We are not about shouting at each other or arguing or, creating a battleground. We are really about this conversation. There's often the reaction of reverse, people call out reverse racism. For example, the reverse racism against white men in America at this time. And Corey says, you don't know what it's like to be filled with anger, to want to say something, but you can't because you're afraid of things and they might escalate and you don't feel safe. Just think of the amount of information, the amount of emotion we are missing access to when a Black first person is put in that position of not feeling safe. So she goes on to say, what if there's another way? What if there's a way to make space for all of our experiences, to make space for my truth and your truth, my anger, your grief, and so on, my fear and your hope for the future, all to sit side by side. We can't do that unless we are willing to talk in a calm way and to listen very differently. She also stresses cultivating curiosity. Create the desire in yourself, or cultivate the desire to hear about an experience and a perspective that is different from your own. To me, that's where knowledge comes from. It comes from really being open to something new. She also recommends negotiating relationships with vulnerability. Nothing about our experiences are easy. We'll get frustrated, angry, but I love this. We are called to be gracious in this process. Be gracious. When we decide to create a belonging community, when something is happening to you or to me, we speak because we belong to each other. We need to just keep chipping away at this division between us. We really do belong to each other. I think if you imagine a scenario where a person of another race is in a crisis situation, the instinct in us is very human. It's to help. It is not to go to that racial place. We need to start there at least and think about how we do belong, how we need each other. I just love the idea. I mean, that harkens back to Martin Luther King's idea of a beloved community. It encompasses humanity in a different way that transcends differences. It transcends diversity. It transcends race, because we are able to do those things we would not be able to do to tackle the problem of racism. I also love this point. She says, Charlottesville is not how racism shows up every day. It's much more, I want to say obsequious. Is that the right word? It's just sneaky and subtle and extremely hurtful. So one of the final things she talks about is courage. We have to be courageous. Courage is doing the thing that you don't want to do, but it needs to be done. If we're going to create a new way of belonging and being a community, we must be courageous. So that is the content from Corey that really struck me, because things have happened to me recently where I have felt unsafe. I have felt shamed, attacked, a whole host of things that make me want to pull back. And just coincidentally, this article by Shereen Daniels came across my desk through LinkedIn. It's called Protecting Your Peace, Acknowledging the Emotional Strain of Speaking Up About Race. Now, when I started to read this article, and when I saw the title, I thought it was just for me. But the irony here is that it is an article written to Black people about protecting their own peace. So what I kind of glean from this is that we are in this together for sure. We have this belonging now of facing the things that we are afraid to do. And we have to know and be confident in the things that we know so that we can speak up calmly and that we can listen differently and be gracious. I just think those things are such beautiful concepts to hold on to. She says, I want to create a space. This is Shereen reminding you. I want to create a space to explore these emotions, not just as something to be managed per se, but to be acknowledged and validated. That you, yet because very little space is created to unpack these emotions, it can often feel like you're the only one. There are so many of us feeling that we're the only one. I mean, imagine if that veil was lifted. Therefore, something is wrong with you because you're feeling the way you do. You are not on your own. Your feelings are valid. So, like I say, as I read through this, anybody who is going to be speaking up about anti-racism can feel these feelings of fear, resentment, anger, and so on. Clearly, it's different for me as a white person. It's different. It's a different experience. But if we go into that space with our Black colleagues and friends and family members, we are going to have similar experiences. I want to read a quote from a book that I'm reading now, and it's by Bishop Michael Curry. He's a presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. Just so you might remember him, he married Meghan and Harry, Prince Harry. And you might remember him in the wedding, how he broke so many norms in that room, the stiffness of the behavior in royal spaces and so on. And he was all about love. And his book is called Love is the Way. And he talks about dreaming about an environment that we could have, but the dream is the first step. So he says, when reality becomes beyond the point of hope, some people lift up their eyes beyond reality and gift us with the dream from which sparks of hope fly and ignite those who hear it. So I want to be in that space where I dream the reality that we're really shooting for in this podcast and so many other spaces, that will become a reality, and that we will foster hope. And what else is in here? Ignite those who hear us.
Mm-hmm.
Any reactions, ladies?
Yeah, that's amazing. One of the things when you were talking, it occurred to me that something that I had gotten out of that article as well, the Protecting Your Peace article, is that part of the weight for Black employees in these types of spaces to be able to speak their truth is that I'm going to read it exactly as I picked it up. These discussions often carry an additional emotional weight that comes with the desire to be a part of the solution, while at the same time acknowledging we didn't create the problem. So if you look at it from that perspective as well, it really does carry a heavy burden. But then on the other hand, when I look at two individuals as examples here, Mavis and Gail, that these are two very dear friends of mine who have stepped up to the plate, and they're starting to take on and bear some of that burden with me. So that's the power and the things that Shereen Daniels is talking about in her work. And when you couple that with the stuff that that Dr. Livingston talked about in his work, that's the power of that community. You mentioned Dr. King and that beloved community. That's the power of all of that. And that's the beauty of all of that. Gail, did you have a comment? We have about another minute or two before we take a quick break.
Well, I certainly agree with what you're all saying. I mean, it's really, it has to come from within. And it isn't just, this is what you should be doing. You have to really look in that mirror and self-examine where are you with racism, and to be that authentically honest with yourself, and then begin to say, okay, what do I really believe? And what I believe, how absolutely true is it? And start to begin to just question it, even at that very core level. And then that can then lead you into many different conversations and growth and change. But we all have to do that ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Didn't go into today, but yes, looking inside yourself and what you believe, it's really the very start of it.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it. Otherwise, I think it's just sort of a natural mechanism or something our society has encouraged to respond negatively along the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to even notice when that is being triggered. Like, why do I need to say, but I'm not privileged. I've had troubles in my life too. What makes me feel like that is the appropriate response?
Mm-hmm. And that goes directly back to the idea of critical self-reflection. What are those thoughts, beliefs, and ideas that I actually hold when it comes to these discussions about racism and how do I show up through my words, actions, and behaviors. So we're going to take a quick break and then we'll come back and continue the conversation. Back to Inflection Point Podcast and our community conversations for 2024. In this episode, we are discussing the bestseller, The Antiracist Organization, Dismantling Systemic Racism in the Workplace, written by Shereen Daniels, an author from the UK. So at this point, I'm going to pass the baton over to Gail, and she's going to talk about how do you take some of that data that Shereen talks about? How do you take some of that data and turn it into insights? So take it away, Gail.
All right. So she talks about RACE as an acronym for recognize the problem, analyze the impact, commit to action, and empower for change. And the model is created to provide a framework to ensure the action you take is actually deliberate, intentional, and impactful. So she looks at identifying the problem, but what many people do, they very quickly will say that it's probably a lack of representation is actually the problem, that there aren't enough Black or people of color that are being hired, that's where they should start. HR might not even offer up that they're still trying to collate ethnicity data for their colleagues to enable better evaluation. Beyond the usual attraction, retention, and development metrics, what else is someone able to do or should be doing or looking at? So Shereen Daniels came up with 32 metrics, which I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll go through a few of them, that she believes that when we ask these questions and find the answers to these questions, that these are steps that we can take in an organization to be able to dismantle racism and truly make an authentic change. So one of them is called attraction. How is your employer brand perceived by Black candidates? And how do you rate on external employer review sites? Are they consistent themes appearing? And obviously that would be very important, right? But how many organizations actually do a survey and find out how Black candidates actually do perceive this, or even in an interview process? I'm going to guess there's not many that do that. And that's something that a place that they can start is by just looking at what's attracting not just the white population, but what's attracting Black population, people of color. The other is succession planning. Like how many different roles on average do your colleagues perform during their tenure? Seniority. How does this compare to non-Black colleagues? And how far do your Black colleagues have formal or informal sponsors? And who speaks up and advocates for them in the senior meetings, internally and externally? And again, I mean, do they specifically and consistently actually do that? And again, I'm going to believe that they probably don't. And that's who probably needs it the most. For any person of color or Black and a Black person to go into an organization where it's predominantly white, you would need to have that for them. It would be, it would make too much sense to not do that, right? To do that. And many people, I believe, are ignoring that, and HR are ignoring that too. Another one is performance management. What's the correlation between someone's performance grade and their pay and remuneration? And what's the correlation to grade and promotions? And based on what actually happens, not hypothetically. And that would be an interesting metric to actually investigate and see what is the correlation, and how many of employees are equally being reimbursed and given the pay and remuneration for what they actually are performing at the same levels, right? Employee relations. If you have a zero tolerance approach to racism, how do you enforce that? And is it without exception? That's a zero tolerance, right? And many corporations may have and say they have a zero tolerance approach to racism, but how do they actually enforce it? How do they actually have that zero tolerance? And some of the talks that we did last week talked about that zero tolerance. The one person that was a patient and actually the CEO of a major health organization in London and witnessed the racism behavior of different people there. And he had a zero tolerance for it. And to the point of firing people, or certainly and putting the nurse that was involved in the racism that was against her in charge of that. So how much is that corporation really willing to step up and to really put forth that belief system and do the work that they need to with everyone that is in that organization at all the different levels that they have? And so it has to start from the top down. And it has to then heal from the bottom up, right? As we talked about last week. So the two things that I was going to personally relate this to, and I have to thank Anita for reminding me that because the nonprofit that I lead is a very small nonprofit that is a working volunteer group of people, and I've always believed in that, and that's one of our core values is being anti-racist, and to the point where I believe that people that have been attracted to work in OMA have not just been trained in that and educated in that, but they've come from that place within themselves, that they've already done some of the work, and so it's almost as if they couldn't mix in with the rest of us if they came in and they were racist. And the way I met Anita, and I think she's mentioned the story before, but I'll reiterate it, was we were doing a lecture series, one of the things that we do with OMA. And she came to one of our lectures, and she was the only Black person there. And the rest of the audience was all white. And I met her because one of our board members also drives an Uber, and she had been talking about Anita and that she had met her as a client that she picked up to take places, and this person is often getting into very spiritual conversations with people, and certainly did with Anita. And so Anita came to meet us and to also experience the lecture that we were having. But what she told me afterwards, and one of the metrics that she talks about is, what are your customers and clients saying online? But what are they saying about what they've experienced by meeting, by interacting with whatever the business or organization might be? And what Anita said is that she felt completely, within about, I don't know how long it was, she completely felt comfortable being there, and she didn't feel that she was the only Black person there. She felt accepted and welcomed, and that is exactly what one of our core values is, and to be able to be welcoming to everyone. And so I'm grateful that she reminded me of that, and that the authenticity of who I am, obviously, and who the group is, and the organization that I represent is also very authentic, because it has to come from within. We have to be willing to look within that mirror, as I said, and see what gets in the way. And we all that are white have had some historical background of generations that have been racist of some various degree. And it's impossible to have that imprint not be there within us, right? And so it's really about taking that time and looking in that mirror and looking within ourselves and being honest with ourselves. And what do I need to do then to change that, to reframe that, to find what is absolutely true and to believe that? And so I think that metric that she was recommending is a very valuable one, right? And the other one that we obviously, as I mentioned, is the employee relations, that we do have a zero tolerance to our approach to racism. And there is no exception to that, that I personally or professionally. My oldest sister is racist, and at a Thanksgiving dinner, she said, I used the N-word, and I looked at her, I said, you will not use that word or language in my company or my children's company. And I said, and if you won't stop, you have to leave. And she left, and she hasn't been back to a holiday dinner since. And that's okay, because that's the zero tolerance that we all have to have. Yeah. And so when I read through this, I mean, there's so much that is there now, and this book that she has written, that Shereen Daniels has written is really worth reading. It's really very remarkable. And listen to her podcast or YouTube, because she has it on both. And she's just a very brilliant and authentic, down to earth person that knows her stuff and is worth listening to and reading. The other piece that I wanted to mention is from the Center for Creative Leadership. And they use the DAC model that Anita, you talked about before. And it also says what makes a good leader. If we've taken every positive human quality and made it into a requirement for effective leadership, it's really time to step back and take a different approach, because leadership isn't actually all about individual leaders and their capabilities, right? We have to examine the whole system because it's involved in making leadership happen. And so how can you tell if leadership is happening in a team, in a work group, or on a task force, or across the organization? You have to be willing to look at those questions and find those answers, right? So I think it's really important to really challenge yourself and also to expose yourself to what is out there. I can tell you personally that the last couple of weeks that I've probably had 4 or 5 white people tell me about how this Black person was given this job. Different organizations, different experiences, different professions. And I looked and I said, you realize that people of color, Black people, they want to have that job given to them, not because of the color of their skin, but because they're qualified for it. And they want to be recognized for the abilities and the education and the hard work that they've put into being in that position to even apply for that job. So you need to think about how you're responding and what you're blaming that on, why you didn't or that person didn't get that job, because that's not what this is about. And so it says we all have that opportunity to clarify and to make statements when we need to, when it's appropriate to, right? And to just be honest, because a lot of people aren't aware, and we all can become aware. Mavis, Anita?
Yeah, excellent. Mavis, did you have any comments?
A few, actually. I think it's really interesting for Shereen to come up with diagnostic metrics that are able to tell an organization if, in fact, they are making progress. It's difficult to measure human behavior. You're still assigning numbers to things. And so I think that's a really brave approach. I've got to read her book too, because I'm wondering about the results of studying the statistics on adopting anti-racist behavior versus conversations that support it. It seems like you'd need both. And, the diagnostics then. I was thinking, Gail, too, about Oma, how you started it yourself and you had the kind of luxury of this is a full stop, zero tolerance anti-racist organization. And comparing that to a corporation that is full of people who have lifelong experiences in racist environments and how to get on top of that beast. So I don't know, those, it's a very different challenge, but if you're going to start a small organization, that's a good place to start.
Well, that's right. To create a space that, everybody can come to and feel safe and feel, accepted and feel seen for who they are.
Right.
Right.
And one of the memorable pieces of Gail's story in terms of how she and I met is eventually our relationship evolved, and she invited me to be a member of the board for OMA. And I remember coming to the very first meeting, and she was very open about what she was looking for. And one of the things that she said to me was, look at us. We're all white. We all look the same. We need somebody like you to help us to see through a different lens altogether. And so she was literally inviting the wholeness of who I am as a person into her organization, which gave me the freedom and the liberty to bring my full story into her organization. And for that, we've been friends ever since then. So I think what it speaks to is that it is possible to do these things. It is possible to develop these types of relationships and these types of connections. To build, exactly.
Yes.
To build something better.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. We all have that ability.
Yeah. And to Shereen's point, we'll know when the battle is over.
Yeah.
When we don't have to use the word racism anymore.
That's
when the
right.
word racism isn't even a part of the lexicon
Yeah.
anymore. Right? And that's why we do this work in spite of. That's why we continue to do what it is we do. So I'm actually going to read a quote. It's a really cool quote from Shereen Daniels. I always talk about my work being in two halves. One is helping leaders and teams understand the strategic imperative and the context so that they can make better decisions about how they navigate this for the long term. Not thinking that this is going to be solved in a year or two's time. I mean, just think about it. The problem of racism has been here like forever. Like it's just, so it's not going to be just a year or two. We'll do this work and then, everything will be wonderful. No, that's not the case here. And then she goes on to say, the other side is empowering Black colleagues, Black professionals in the workplace, in business to say, even though the organizations and the backdrop of what we're working with is not yet optimized for anti-racism, let us not give our power away.
That's right.
Let's remind ourselves of who we are. Let's remind ourselves what we have accomplished as a people, despite our continued depression, despite the continued reluctance to address the structural barriers that hold us back. And in so many cases, we're winning regardless. So when I think about the whole idea of anti-racism, and you think about people like Ibram Kendi, you think about Ta-Nehisi Coates, and you think about Nicole Hannah-Jones, and those types of people who literally opened up this Pandora's box to have these legitimate, genuine conversations about racism. But the fact of the matter is, the action of anti-racism has been going on since the first boatload of Africans came to America. There's always been resistance. And what we're seeing now is it's almost like this grand multiplication of resistance, because we have different tools at our disposal now that we can use to repeatedly get these messages out. Just repeatedly telling our stories, speaking truth, speaking our experiences and all of that, and picking up more and more and more people along the way who are locking arms with us. These two women right here, Mavis and Gail, have been locked arms with me for a number of years now. And that's the beauty. When I just think about the three of us, that is the beauty of acknowledging the potential of what can be there, right? It's just a beautiful thing. So then how do we relate this back to the Cairo question, right?
Can you interject something before?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's relevant to something you just said about racism won't be solved in a year or 2 years or whatever. Good news is a very dear friend of mine has started taking an anti-racism class at her church.
Mm-hmm.
She's been sending me the content, and I watched the video by this guy. I think his name is Jay Smooth. Anyway, he uses some kind of funny analogies that might really stick, that addressing racism is like taking care of your health. You don't go to the dentist once in your life and say, I'm good. You go on a regular basis, you check yourself, you learn about your dental health, how you can keep yourself healthy, and so on. And I thought, yeah, it's like constantly having checkups, constantly interacting with people different from yourself, and making sure that you're staying healthy and not slipping in to past behaviors.
Yes. And that really links to my thoughts around the idea that all of this work that we're doing, this anti-racism work that we're doing and activating that kind of mindset, when we get to a place where we can look at it and say, we're seeing the social change that we want to see. We are seeing that justice. But at the same time, there will still continue to be a battle to sustain those winnings.
Exactly.
So getting there to that optimum place, if you will, is one thing. Mm-hmm. But it's also doing the work that maintains this new status or this new way of looking at American culture and the way we relate to one another and all of that. Once we get there, we have to do the work to sustain it. Right? And so when I think about the sustainability aspect of all of that, it takes me back to the Cairo question. And the Cairo question being, will Cairo is now 4 years old, will he have to protest in his lifetime for the birthright to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which he was born? And I ask that question every time we have an episode. Because if we're not looking at this work through the lens of 4-year-old children, then we're falling short. Because looking through that lens, to me, is the same as looking through the lens of sustainability. So how do we sustain all of this so that as Cairo grows, the probability of him having to protest for that birthright gets minimized for his generation. But then there'll be another generation and another generation and another generation. And the fact of the matter is, once we move into this space of fully actualized anti-racism, we don't want to go back. We don't want to go back. We literally have about 2 minutes. So go ahead, Megan.
King family said that the beloved community could be achieved through education, training, courage, and determination, and regular checkups. I added that last part. Yeah, education, all of that is, that's
absolutely. It. Absolutely. So the ultimate question is really based on each one of us taking step towards that personal accountability. How do I want to define myself as a member of society, as a leader, as a learner standing on this precipice of change where we currently find ourselves? We all have a role to play. And our call to action, I've skipped our call to action. I wanted to make sure that I always say this. Our call to action is to stay woke and be prepared to vote. So staying woke, an acronym. Woke is an acronym. So stay well-informed, open-minded, kind, and empathetic. And be prepared to vote. That is to raise your voice in a way that is organized to empower. That's the whole entire point of where we are in this moment right now. And so What will you do to ensure that Cairo and his counterparts have that birthright to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which they are born? So I leave you with those words, and thank you for joining us on this episode of Inflection Point Podcast. And we are here every first and third Wednesday on Transformation Talk Radio at 3 p.m. Pacific Time, 6 p.m. Eastern Time, as we continue our community conversations. Thank you for listening to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. The journey towards anti-racism and social change doesn't stop here. Truth, reconciliation, and healing come from ongoing, open, honest, and deliberate conversations. Continue to dive in and deconstruct your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs as we band together to manifest social change. Tune in to Inflection Point Podcast every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, here on TransformationTalkRadio.com for more conversations about how we can cultivate change from the inside out.
The views expressed on this program are those of the host, guests, and callers, and do not necessarily reflect the views of the station, its management, or advertisers. You're listening to Transformation Talk Radio.